Before God uses you, He allows these failures. There are moments when life collapses in ways you never saw coming. Not slowly, not gently, but suddenly something fails, something falls apart. Something you believed God would never allow slips through your hand. And in the aftermath, the question is not just why did this happen, but why did God let it happen? You replay your prayers. You revisit your obedience. You wonder whether the failure was proof that you misunderstood God, or worse, that He has turned away from you. But Scripture tells a deeper, more unsettling truth. Some failures are not accidents. They are permitted. Not because God delights in breaking His people, but because He refuses to use lives that have not been stripped of what would eventually destroy them. God does not build purpose on untested strength. He does not entrust calling to unbroken pride. And He does not place weight on a life that has never collapsed under its own limits. The failures God allows are not the ones that erase you. They are the ones that expose you. They reveal where you trusted yourself more than God, where image mattered more than integrity, where success covered immaturity, where confidence replaced dependence. And when those things fail, it hurts in a way encouragement cannot quickly heal, because failure removes illusions. It takes away the version of you that thought you were ready before you were refined. What makes these moments confusing is that they often come after obedience, after prayer, after sacrifice, after you thought you were finally walking in alignment. That is why they feel unfair. But divine permission is not divine punishment. God allows certain failures because He sees further than you do. He knows what unchecked strength would do to you later. He knows what untested gifting would cost you when influence comes. And He knows what pride disguised as confidence would eventually destroy. These failures do not mean God has abandoned you. They often mean He has decided to take responsibility for who you are becoming. He allows the fall so He can rebuild on something real, something humble, something dependent, something that can carry authority without being corrupted by it. If your life has experienced a failure that humbled you, rather than erased you, this message is not meant to reopen wounds. It is meant to reinterpret them. Because before God uses someone, He often allows them to fail in ways that strip illusion, deepen surrender, and mark the soul with a kind of wisdom success could never give. And if something in you recognizes this season, not with excitement but with quiet recognition, it may be because God has not finished with you. He may be preparing to use the very places where you once thought everything was lost. Number 1, the failure that breaks your self-reliance. One of the first failures God allows before He uses someone is the kind that dismantles self-reliance. This is the moment when what you were confident in, your ability, discipline, wisdom, preparation, or spiritual maturity, proves insufficient. You did what you knew to do, you applied what worked before, and still, it failed. Not because you were careless, but because God was exposing a foundation that could not carry what was coming next. This failure is deeply unsettling, because it confronts your identity. You may have believed you were strong enough, wise enough, or ready enough, and then something happens that reveals how much you were still leaning on yourself. God allows this not to shame you, but to save you. Because self-reliance may look like strength, but it becomes dangerous when responsibility increases. Scripture consistently shows that God does not use people who trust themselves deeply. He uses those who have learned how limited they truly are. Self-reliance works until it doesn't, and when it fails under pressure, God steps in. Not to mock your weakness, but to replace independence with dependence. This kind of failure leaves you quieter, less certain, less quick to assume you know the answer. You begin to pray differently, not with confidence in outcomes, but with surrender of control. You stop rushing ahead of God and start waiting for Him. That shift is not regression. It is recalibration. That shift is not regression. If you've experienced a failure that shattered your confidence in yourself, but somehow deepened your reliance on God, that failure was not destructive. It was preparatory. God was breaking what would have broken you later. He was dismantling self-trust, so divine trust could take its place. God does not use lives built on self-reliance. He uses lives built on surrender. And a failure that humbles you without destroying you is often the first sign that God is preparing to entrust you with something heavier than you could have carried alone. Number 2, the failure that exposes your motives. Another failure God allows before He uses someone is the kind that exposes motives you didn't realize were mixed. This is not the failure of blatant wrongdoing. It is the failure that reveals why you were doing what you were doing. You may have served faithfully, pursued good things, or chased what looked like God's will, but when it fell apart, you were forced to confront a difficult truth. Not everything driving you was as pure as you believed. This exposure is painful because it removes self-deception. You begin to see where validation mattered more than obedience, where recognition quietly shaped your decisions, where calling became entangled with identity. And when those motives are exposed, the collapse feels personal, because it touches not just what you did, but why you did it. God allows this failure because impure motives cannot survive. Increased influence. They may remain hidden in small spaces, but they become destructive when authority grows. God is not interested in using people who do the right things for the wrong reasons, so He allows exposure early, when it can still heal instead of ruin. This failure changes how you move forward. You become slower, more prayerful, more honest with yourself. You stop chasing outcomes and start seeking alignment. You no longer want success if it costs your soul. That shift is not discouragement, it is maturity. Scripture shows us that God refines the heart before He releases responsibility. Motive matters to Him because motive determines how power is handled. A purified heart can carry weight without becoming proud. A clarified motive can steward influence without corruption. If you've experienced a failure that forced you to confront yourself, your intentions, your desires, your hidden expectations, that failure was not meant to disqualify you. It was meant to cleanse you. God was removing what would have poisoned your purpose later. God uses people whose motives have been exposed, corrected, and surrendered. And the failure that reveals your heart is often the one that makes your life trustworthy in God's hands. Number 3, the failure that cost you your reputation or image. One of the most painful failures God allows before He uses someone is the failure that touches your image, how you are seen, remembered, and spoken about. This is the kind of failure that doesn't stay private. It affects your credibility. It changes how people talk about you. It leaves you misunderstood, reduced, or quietly reclassified in the minds of others. And once that happens, there is no quick way to restore what was lost. This failure hurts deeply because reputation feels tied to identity. You may have worked hard to be seen as trustworthy, capable, faithful, or strong. And then something happens that fractures that image. People who once respected you now question you. Doors that once opened easily begin to close. You realize that the way others see you is no longer under your control. God allows this failure because image can become a dangerous substitute for identity. When reputation becomes something you protect at all costs, it can quietly rule your decisions. God does not want to use people who are led by how they appear. He wants to use people who are anchored in who they are before Him, even if the world never fully restores its opinion. This kind of failure strips away performance. You stop serving to be seen. You stop obeying to maintain approval. You begin to ask harder questions. Who am I if I am never celebrated again? Will I still follow God if no one affirms me? Those questions are not meant to break you. They are meant to root you. Scripture shows us that God often allowed the reputations of those he used to be shattered before he entrusted them with authority. Because authority built on image collapses under pressure. Authority built on humility endures. If you've lost how people see you and found yourself forced to cling to God alone, this failure was not wasted. God was freeing you from the burden of image, so you could carry something heavier without being controlled by it. God does not entrust influence to people who need to be admired. He entrusts it to those who have learned how to stand without applause. And the failure that costs your reputation is often the one that secures your identity in God. Number 4. The failure that leaves you alone with God. Another failure God allows before he uses someone is the kind that leaves you alone. Not physically isolated in every sense, but relationally reduced. Support thins. Voice is quiet. People step back, some because they don't understand, others because they no longer benefit from being close. And suddenly the network you leaned on is gone. This failure is devastating because it removes the comfort of shared faith. You can no longer hide behind group strength or borrowed confidence. You are left with God and whatever is real between you and him. That solitude can feel frightening at first, because it exposes how much you relied on people to steady you instead of God. God allows this failure because intimacy cannot be outsourced. Calling cannot be sustained on community alone. When God plans to use someone deeply, he first teaches them how to stand alone with him, without validation, without reinforcement, without constant reassurance. In this season, prayer becomes less polished and more honest. Faith becomes quieter but deeper. You stop performing spiritually and start relating authentically. You discover whether God himself is enough when everything else is stripped away. Scripture shows that many of those God used most powerfully walked through seasons of isolation after failure. Not because God abandoned them, but because he drew them closer, away from noise, away from comparison, away from distraction. Alone does not mean forgotten. Often it means chosen for deeper formation. If you've experienced a failure that reduced your circle and left you feeling alone with God, do not assume you were pushed aside. You may have been pulled closer. God was teaching you how to hear his voice without crowd interference, how to obey without encouragement, how to remain faithful without witnesses. God uses people who know him personally, not just publicly. And the failure that leaves you alone with God is often the place where intimacy deepens and authority is quietly formed. Number 5. The failure that teaches you obedience without reward. One of the most refining failures God allows before he uses someone is the failure that removes reward from obedience. This is the season when you continue to do what is right, but nothing improves. You obey, but restoration does not come quickly. You remain faithful, but recognition disappears. The visible benefits of obedience are gone, and what remains is a quieter, heavier question. Will I still obey God when obedience gives me nothing back? This failure is difficult because it strips away transactional faith. It exposes whether your obedience was rooted in trust or expectation. You may realize that somewhere along the way you believed faithfulness would guarantee protection from loss, misunderstanding, or delay. And when that belief collapses, obedience becomes costly in a way it never was before. God allows this failure because obedience tied to reward cannot sustain calling. If you only obey when outcomes are favorable, your faith will eventually collapse under responsibility. God is not forming servants who follow him for benefits. He is forming stewards who follow him because he is God. In this season, obedience becomes quieter and more deliberate. You stop asking, "What will this get me?" and begin asking, "Is this what honors God?" That shift is not small. It is the difference between conditional faith and surrendered faith. Scripture shows us that those God trusted most learned to obey without immediate reward. They followed God through loss, delay, and obscurity. Their obedience was no longer fueled by anticipation of success, but by reverence for God Himself. If you've experienced a failure where obedience no longer feels rewarding, do not assume God is displeased. He may be deepening your faith beyond outcomes. He is teaching you how to remain faithful when nothing is restored yet. God uses people whose obedience does not depend on applause, advancement, or relief. And the failure that removes reward is often the one that makes obedience pure enough to carry authority. Number 6. The failure that redefines how you hear God. Another failure God allows before He uses someone is the failure that forces them to relearn how they hear Him. This is the moment when you realize that what you thought was clarity may have been assumption, enthusiasm, or incomplete discernment. You acted sincerely but not fully aligned, and when the result collapsed, you were left questioning not just the decision, but your spiritual sensitivity. This kind of failure is deeply humbling because it touches your confidence and discernment. You may wonder if you can trust yourself again, if you heard God clearly, if you rushed ahead, if you relied too heavily on feelings instead of wisdom. And that questioning is painful, but necessary. God allows this failure because discernment is not formed through success alone. It is sharpened through correction, through reflection, through learning the difference between God's voice and your own desires. God is not punishing you for mishearing. He is retraining you to listen more deeply. After this failure, you move differently. You pray longer. You wait more. You seek confirmation instead of momentum. You become less impressed by urgency and more attentive to peace. This slower, more careful listening is not hesitation. It is maturity. Scripture shows that many God used had to learn discernment through painful missteps. Their failures taught them how to distinguish timing, motive, and direction. And once refined, their sensitivity became sharper than before. If you've experienced a failure that caused you to question how you hear God, do not despair. God may be reshaping your spiritual perception. He is teaching you how to listen with humility instead of confidence alone. God uses people who have learned how to hear Him accurately, not perfectly, but honestly. And the failure that retrains your spiritual hearing is often the one that prepares you to move with wisdom instead of impulse. Number 7. The failure that marks you with humility and authority. The final failure God often allows before He uses someone is the one that permanently reshapes how they carry themselves. This failure does not just humble you temporarily, it marks you. After it, you no longer speak the same way. You no longer assume. You no longer rush. There is a weight in you now. A restraint, a sobriety that wasn't there before. And that change is not loss. It is formation. This failure removes arrogance without destroying confidence. It strips entitlement without killing courage. You stop needing to prove yourself. You stop chasing validation. You stop assuming you deserve platforms, opportunities, or influence. Instead, you move with reverence, aware of how fragile you are, how faithful God has been, and how costly disobedience can become. What emerges from this failure is not timidity but authority. Quiet authority. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that doesn't dominate conversations. The kind that carries credibility because it has been through collapse and survived without bitterness. People may not know your story, but they can feel the weight of it when you speak. Scripture shows us that God entrusts authority only to those who have been broken without becoming bitter. Authority is dangerous in the hands of the untested, but in the hands of someone marked by humility, it becomes safe. God knows that those who remember their own failure will steward responsibility with care. If you look at your life and realize that something in you has permanently changed, not just emotionally but spiritually, this may be why you are slower to judge, quicker to listen, more careful with influence, less impressed by appearance. That is not weakness. That is authority being formed through surrender. God does not use people who have never fallen. He uses people who fell, were humbled, were restored, and now walk with awareness. And the failure that marked you with humility is often the one that qualifies you to carry authority without abusing it. What once felt like disqualification has become distinction, and that mark etched through failure and grace is something God trusts. Conclusion: God does not waste the failures He allows. If you have recognized your own story in these failures, let this truth settle deeply into your spirit. God does not waste what He allows. Every collapse, every exposure, every humbling moment was not proof that you were unfit. It was evidence that God was involved in your formation. You were not abandoned in the failure. You were not forgotten in the fallout. In the fallout, you were not disqualified by the collapse. You were being prepared. God allows certain failures because He refuses to build purpose on illusion. He strips what would have corrupted you later. He exposes what could not survive influence. And He humbles what He intends to use without destroying it. The failure was not the end. It was the threshold. If your life has been marked by a failure that changed you, slowed you, sobered you, and deepened you, do not rush to erase it. That failure may be the very thing that makes your life trustworthy in God's hands. What broke you is now shaping you. What humbled you is now protecting you. And what nearly ended you is now forming wisdom success never could. Take a moment to reflect, not on what you lost, but on who you became. Ask yourself not why did this happen to me, but what did God protect me from becoming? That question reframes everything. If this message spoke to you, share it with someone who is still interpreting their failure as rejection. And if you want more messages that speak honestly about formation, surrender, and calling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Before God uses someone, He often allows them to fail. Not to destroy them, but to make them safe to use.